But we're going to get started. So our first session this afternoon is entitled Mapping the National Creative Aging Network. And it is a great pleasure to introduce our session speakers, Heather Ikemire, Deputy Director of Learning and Engagement at the National Guild for Community Arts Education, as well as Elizabeth Merritt, Vice President for Strategic Foresight and Founding Director, Center for the Future of Museums at the American Alliance of Museums. So one of the first things that the NASA planning team considered when we were designing the Creative Aging Institute is that we are very much adding on to an existing ongoing conversation about creative aging among arts and cultural organizations, even if our focus on the work of state arts agencies in the space is a somewhat new angle. And here again, we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to our partners at Aroha Philanthropies for being a driving force to make creative aging a real thriving focal point of arts learning. Thanks to the important investments that Aroha has made and continues to make in the work of both the Guild and AAM, we have so much to learn from these two partners about the work, about what it means to build and sustain creative aging programs across many different contexts and within many different communities. Not coincidentally, the Guild and AAM also work in close partnership with Lifetime Arts, who will be presenting our 4:45 p.m. Eastern session this afternoon. For those who are with us today in the audience who aren't familiar with these national organizations and their networks, I'll briefly share their missions. Founded in 1937, the National Guild for Community Arts Education is the sole national service organization for providers of community arts education. Their mission is to ensure that all people have opportunities to maximize their creative potential by developing leaders, strengthening organizations, and advocating for community arts education. The Guild's Catalyzing Creative Aging program, presented in partnership with Lifetime Arts, is a multi-phase initiative designed to support the establishment of new creative aging programs at nonprofit arts education organizations nationwide, and has served 3 cohorts of practitioners from 2017 through 2020. The American Alliance of Museums mission is to champion museums and nurture excellence in partnership with their members and allies. Since 1906, the Alliance has been a leader in developing best practices and advocating for museums, as well as providing a host of opportunities to museum staff and volunteers. More than 35,000 individual museum professionals and volunteers, institutions, and corporate partners benefit from the work of the Alliance. In June, the Alliance released a landmark report commissioned by AAM and funded by Aroha Philanthropies entitled Museums and Creative Aging, a Healthful Partnership. And it calls on museums to change the narrative about what it means to grow old in America. So Carol is going to helpfully drop these links into the chat. They're the websites of the Guild and AAM, including a link to this exciting new report. So Heather and Elizabeth, I am really happy to welcome you and start our conversation. And I want to ask you, just to get us started, what are some big takeaways that you each might share with our audience about your efforts to support creative aging activities in your networks over the years? And in particular, if there are specific organizations in your networks who are leading and implementing innovative creative aging programs, please do call them out so that our audience will know where they're located across the country, as well as what they're doing. So Heather, why don't we start with you about some big takeaways?
Great, thanks. And thanks, Susan, for having us. And great to see so many familiar faces here today. I think the first takeaway is, so the Guild has been supporting the development of new and existing creative aging programs within community arts education organizations nationwide most recently through our Catalyzing Creative Aging program in partnership with Lifetime Arts, but prior to that through a pretty longstanding partnership with MetLife Foundation that was supporting new and existing creative aging programs. And I think through all those programs, which have offered a combination of training, technical assistance, advocacy, and some seed grants, I think the biggest takeaway is that, yes, we want new programs to take root within our cultural institutions nationwide. But I think one thing is that it's also about shifting culture. So it's not just about the development of new programs. And I think before I get there, I just want to underscore that it's also a longstanding practice. So while the Guild's model that we share with Lifetime Arts and others builds off of a landmark study by Gene Cohen, and there's real power in codifying that model and naming this practice in order to amplify it. I think that I want to start by just acknowledging that there's been work happening in communities with elders, particularly in communities of color, for generations. And so while we amplify this model and we honor the real power of it, just want to note that there's great work happening and has been happening that might not even be aware of the term creative aging, right? Might be calling it other things. And so that's something maybe we can come back to in the discussion. I think the other thing to note is that in our partnership with Lifetime Arts and others, that while we're doing training that is helping organizations understand how to develop really effective programs, that training is also very much focused on undoing ageism, so anti-ageism at all levels within an organization. So what we learned in our work with MetLife Foundation many years ago is that if the work around undoing ageism isn't acute from the very beginning, if we're not really talking about the importance of this work at all levels within an institution beyond the program staff, so really getting leadership on board, talking with our boards, talking with our community partners, and training our teaching artists, that the work often doesn't sustain, right? When there's turnover within an organization or when the winds shift. So an example of an organization that has done this really well and is an alumnus of our Catalyzing Creative Aging program, I'll put it in the chat here, is Pullen Arts Center in Raleigh, North Carolina. Pullen Arts Center is a city agency. They're a visual arts center. And several years ago, they went through our Catalyzing Creative Aging program and began a visual arts program for 50 older adults in all 4 quadrants of Raleigh, North Carolina. So they went to the neighborhoods where the older adults were. They didn't require them to come to their center. They expanded their audience, and these older adults worked with them for about 3 hours a week for 12 weeks. So they engaged the city in neighborhoods where they were building new and authentic relationships. And then they trained their entire staff, from their front desk person in those recreation centers to their board, to all of the teaching artists, not just the ones that were in the program, so that there was a culture of, this is why we are doing this work, why it's important to our mission and to our community, so that when you see an older adult in our building, you know why they're there, you can welcome them, you know where to point them to. And then finally, they had a culminating event where, while they were engaging students in the program over the 12 weeks, they were also building and inviting as many public officials in the city that they could to that culminating event. So that program launched in 2018. It still continues to this day. They've been able to continue it and increase their support, and are now also funded by the Office of Raleigh Arts in the city. So I just share that as one example where, yes, there was new programming that happened, but a really intentional effort to understand why we're doing it and to really focus on anti-ageism at multiple levels within the institution and within the partnerships in the city.
Elizabeth, I imagine you have some comments to make along these lines too. What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. And part of it's going to echo some of what Heather said. I want to start by saying one of the top takeaways we've had from doing this work is the importance of really having it embedded at the very highest levels of the institution. There has to be a commitment from the top down. People have to understand, and by people I mean directors and I mean boards of trustees, have to understand why this audience, older Americans, are important. One of the weaknesses we've seen sometimes of even great programs is often if these are initiated by the programming staff or the education staff, they create great programs, which then disappear because, as Heather said, there's turnover or because the funding goes away. So wonderful work that's based on the passions of individuals or small groups are very fragile. However, if we can elevate the conversation so that it's embedded in a primary mission of the organization and it's part of their overall strategy for resilience and for their business plan, it becomes much more stable. So for example, the High Museum of Art in Atlanta has really embedded serving older audiences into their mission, into their programming. They've created a staff position dedicated to it. They've outlined in their plans and in the impact reports they share with their supporters how this is serving the community of Atlanta and how it's advances the museum's mission. I was just looking up some stats. They are saying that 24% of Atlanta residents are going to be aged 60 by 2030. So if you're looking at your community and saying, this is our community, you can build an argument for why this needs to be fundamental to what you do, not just a nice add-on. But the other thing that we've realized as we do this work is ageism and serving aging audiences shares a challenge that we've been addressing in so many fronts in the US over the past couple of years. Including systemic racism, including structural inequalities, which is we can't just solve these problems through individual action or through individual organizations taking action. We have to change attitudes. We have to change societal structures. So for example, even though museums are really trying to do this kind of work, we're doing it in a society that isn't very friendly supporting ageism. Right now, museums spend $2 billion a year on P through 12 education because that's where the money is, right? That's where we focus our attention as a society. So our museum staff and energy and time is focused on P through 12 education because society values learning for kids. Learning for adults is kind of optional. It's nice. We're off on our own. It's self-directed learning, and it might be there, it might not. But what if society and museums, knowing the statistics on aging, knowing that by the year 2035, there are going to be more adults over the age of 65 living in the US than children, took a more equitable approach to education and spent just as much time, attention, and money on older audiences as it does on kids. So those are some of the big takeaways that have shaped our work in this arena.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I keep thinking about our conversation and how one of our takeaways when we were getting ready for this conversation is that investing in creative aging is just as worthy of an investment as investing in K through 12. And at the Guild, you know, we serve hundreds of organizations, community arts education organizations across the country. And we do a benchmarking data survey of that membership every couple of years. And I'm just going to drop these stats in the chat because I think it's easier to see. But of the organizations that completed our recent survey, which was about nearly 200, a total of nearly 510,000 unique students were served by about 154 of those organizations that filled out the survey. 73% were serving school-age youth, so between the ages of 6 and 18. When you look at the census data from 2019, that under 18 population comprises about 22% of our population. Of our membership, 7% were serving adults over the age of 55, even though older adults comprise nearly 30% of the US population. And I think that's significant to note because we know that there's a big demographic shift happening in our country. I think by the year 2035, for the first time in US history, there will be more older adults over the age of 65 than young people under the age of 18. And for the Guild, most of our member organizations do have missions that read something like providing equitable access or access to the arts for all people. But often what we're leaving out are all of the people that are not in that school-aged range. And so what we're finding is that this work really is very mission aligned with community-based arts education organizations. But it hasn't taken root for a number of reasons, which we'll discuss here. But when you consider what's happening in our country and the missions of so many of our organizations to serve our community equitably, I think it's really a priority for us to be thinking about how we're investing in arts learning opportunities for those beyond school-aged youth.
Yeah, it is equity, though I will note it's also self-preservation. Here's a counterintuitive statistic for you. Some people, when I tell people this stat, they do not believe it. I will try and drop in a link later to Susie Wilkenning's data story on museums and older audiences. People assume, well, older people go to museums, right? So you don't have to worry about them as an audience. In fact, if you're looking at age demographic cohorts, fewer people over the age of 50 go to museums than people in younger cohorts. Counterintuitive, but true. So from the point of view of practicality, another reason for museums to think very consciously about the needs of these older audiences, we need to court them. They don't just people don't automatically start coming to museums because they get older.
Elizabeth, you also, I remember in our prep conversation, in this sort of point about the focus that we often have in our arts and culture organizations on education being something more directly related to the P12 or our students in pre-K through 12th grade. You made a point about how also it's not just about the arts learning that happens, but also the teaching and what that means is really different for older adults. Can you just expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, one of the beautiful things about this kind of programming is that it's an opportunity to break the power hierarchies that usually exist in places like museums, because the paradigm of the 19th or even the 20th century museum is museums teach people things. We have an exhibit, you come and learn about it. We do a program, we come and lecture you about it. One of the nice things about artist-led learning, where you bring in teaching artists from the community to help people explore arts in a deep way, is it's turning over the reins. It's saying, we're a museum, we're telling you this is a great, high quality, important thing, and here are the people from the community who are the experts, because we're not. So it's not just about teaching older adults, it's about drawing on them as valuable sources of knowledge and giving them a platform to share that with other people. So for example, I'm going to cite some examples from the museums that participated in Seeding Vitality Arts in Museums with funding from Aroha. And there are many other examples, both cited on the Alliance blog where we've covered their stories and in the report we mentioned earlier. But for example, the Union County Historical and Heritage Museum in New Albany, Mississippi. One of the great traditions there is one of pottery. And getting older residents to teach pottery to younger people is both a way of interconnecting generations and transmitting local knowledge. Louisiana State Museum, it was originally planning to do workshops for older Americans on sort of more traditional art forms, but what they found was what people were really interested in were the art forms that were particular to New Orleans, and quite often those are art forms associated with Mardi Gras, where the knowledge and expertise resides in Black populations and experts, what the Louisiana State Museums call culture bearers. So for example, they invited Big Chief Daryl Montana, whose work is on display in the museum, to teach beading. How do you bead Mardi Gras uniform costumes? Or the Heard Museum in Phoenix drew on the local Navajo community to say, can some of your elders who understand weaving teach the tradition of Navajo weaving at the museum. So this is an example of how museums can basically use themselves as a platform for sharing power and authority rather than just being teachers.
A paradigm shift indeed. Heather, this is sort of, oh, go ahead. I think I didn't mean to interrupt you. What were you going to add?
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking another takeaway that we had talked about sort of advocacy or making the case for creative aging, but take it there or anywhere you were planning?
Yeah, I was right there with you, Susan. I think, I think one of the takeaways also is, as we think about how we build understanding and amplify the great work that's happening in creative aging, I think one of the takeaways for me is that it's less about, and this goes to your point, Elizabeth, around really authentically engaging the older adults in our communities and building those relationships and amplifying their voices and their stories and their knowledge in the community. I think there's lessons there about how we advocate for this work as well, so that it's less about speaking on behalf of older adults or having the right talking points on behalf of older adults, but really honoring the older adults. And this goes back to the culture shift piece, right? Really seeing older adults for all of their skills and knowledge as necessary for what it is to have a vibrant, healthy community. And honoring that and giving them ownership of these programs and having them have opportunities to talk about what they need and what is so powerful about these programs. So an example of this that I shared with Susan and Elizabeth in an earlier conversation, I'll put it in the chat, is the Community Music Center in San Francisco. So the Community Music Center in San Francisco is in the Mission District in San Francisco. And 11 years ago, they had an older adult choir, a very small pilot program. But one of the things that they did, which was, I think, really powerful, is it was a multilingual choir. So there are many languages spoken in the Mission District in San Francisco, and they had the older adults learn each other's languages for different repertoire. So the repertoire really spoke to their experience, their cultural backgrounds, and they saw each other learning their languages, so that they were like, I'm gonna invest in doing this too, right? We're all in this together. They also gave the older adults real distinct roles and responsibilities within the choir, so that in that very early pilot, it felt to them this was their program. They were invested, they owned it, it was theirs, it was personal for them, right? And they were really transparent with the older adults in the beginning that this was a pilot and that they were going to need more funding in order to continue it. So this is what happened. In the beginning, they were funded by Google, a little seed grant from Google. And then they had a little bit of money from the city. And they also, one really lovely thing is that there was a study by the University of San Francisco that happened for 5 years that seeded some other choirs around the city, right? So, I think, Carol, you could drop the link to that study in the chat, but it was called the Community of Voices Study. But during this time, they realized, okay, well, this isn't going to last forever. We need to have more money. So they actually engaged the older adults. They wrote postcards. They showed up at town hall meetings, city hall meetings. They listened to the call from the city that they wanted community feedback on how their resources were going to be invested. And then they sent older adults to every single one of those city meetings to show up, write their name down, saying during the public comment section of the meeting, and voice how important these choirs were to their lives, right? And to their community. And now, as a result of that, these choirs grew to 12 sites over 5 years, which is pretty incredible. And they now are funded by the Department of Disability and Aging Services. Now, it's an incredible story, but I think the key takeaway for me is that they weren't sending their staff out to talk about how great these programs were. They were sending the older adults who felt so invested and felt that this was their program and wanted people to invest in it. And I think it's just an incredible story about that really authentic relationship building within these programs and how these programs are building with older adults, not on behalf.
Well, I'd love to pivot from there. You're talking about advocacy, and in the end, what the advocacy is creating is broader support for the program. And I think that speaks to a very important point about funding structures. In museum education, it's often underwritten either by specific grants from funders or granting agencies, or it's sort of underwritten by other income from the museum, from their traditional income streams. And that makes it tremendously fragile. I was talking earlier about the problem with good things happen and then they go away. And sometimes it's because the money disappears, either because the funder stops funding that program or because the museum's whole financial structure becomes fragile in times of economic stress like we're having now. So we can try and get the people who use museum services to pay for those experiences, but then it raises issues of equity. Because if you're saying, great, this is going to continue to work financially because we're charging what it actually costs to reimburse teaching artists fairly for their time and to buy the supplies and provide a high quality experience, that may make it inaccessible to communities who don't have the disposable income that they could spend on this. Or it may create awkward situations where you're trying to say, well, if you need help, we'll pay for it. And that gets that can sound condescending. It can make people feel like they're not being treated as equally valued participants or being offered aid. This goes back to what I was talking about, though, about how this is a structural problem, because I think that so many services provided by museums, including these specific services, are part of having an infrastructure of civilization that supports the people in our community from when they're born to when they die. And it's a joint responsibility to create the funding. And everybody who has a vested interest in that infrastructure working should be paying in. And part of that is local government, who are trying to provide care for citizens as they age. Part of it is the healthcare system, who want people to age in a healthy way, whether that's health providers or insurance companies. So I think part of what we have to do in our advocacy is make the case, since this is not evolving by itself in our society, that all of these players should come together and support this work because it's in their interest to make sure that people don't fall between the cracks, either because they value as a moral imperative in society that we should support people as they age. Hopefully we're all going to be in that category eventually, so we're only creating the own circumstances in which we're going to live. Or because, frankly, it's in their financial self-interest, because insurance agencies don't want people to become homebound and isolated and have all the attendant health risks. So getting them out to programs like this is going to save them money in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we've really learned throughout the pandemic is that the need for these programs is higher than ever. And then the funding and the partnerships to make them happen are getting trickier and trickier. And I agree with you, Elizabeth, that this is really, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, but one of the things that we're finding here at the Guild is that we need to show up as community partners first and arts partners second, right? And we saw that in the pandemic. We saw that one of the first things that our organizations within the Guild did was actually like get their teaching artists on the phone and call older adults, or partner with Meals on Wheels and show up and just hand out meals and to have an opportunity to check in on their students and their community, and then back into the art piece, right? Then back into the art kits and whatnot. And I think that spirit is very much central in this conversation, is that we have to be human-centered first in our approach to this work and how we advocate, how we build these programs, and how we think about even the business models for these programs. One of the things that I'm going to drop in the chat is the Guild's link to the Guild's benchmarking data report. But one of the things that was really fascinating in what we found the last time we did this survey, and the report came out in 2019, is that we saw a 37% increase in Guild member organizations offering creative aging programs within their institutions within 2 years, which directly mapped to our work with catalyzing creative aging. So mapped directly to offering consistent training, technical assistance, and seed grants in partnership with Lifetime Arts. Now 41, this is pre-COVID, but 41% of our member organizations in 2019 were offering creative aging programs. And 11% of those are offering them were new programs within the last year, and 26% of them from 1 to 3 years. So these are new programs. But what I'm getting to is that the funding, almost 70% of the funding for these programs, beyond programs that were offering, programs for a fee. 69% of the funding was coming from Arts Foundation grants. Then of the very small percentage that were getting funding from government sources, 29% of that was local, 22% from the state. Majority of that coming from, and a little bit federal, majority of that coming from the Department of Arts and Humanities and a little bit from Health and Human Services. But I mentioned, I don't always lead the stats, but I think why I'm mentioning that is that I really truly think that these are nascent programs, and in order for them to take root, we need to see the funding coming from multiple sources. And I think there's an opportunity as you all begin to develop work in your states for you all to help us be ambassadors for this work, not only with your fellow arts partners and arts councils in other states, but with other community entities, state entities beyond the arts and humanities, to echo what Elizabeth was saying, to echo this talking point that this is a community-wide effort. And we're gonna need some more funding beyond just those foundation grants for this to be a sustainable practice across our country and across our states. So I just think it's a huge opportunity for all of us on this call to be working collectively to think about how we do that and how we support the programs and the teaching artists and the organizations on the ground to do that in collaboration with us.
Well, Heather, you spark a thought. If I can jump in for a moment, Susan.
Please.
I was having a conversation earlier today with a gentleman who was writing to me and saying, when people say arts and arts, do they mean all museums? When they say arts and culture, do they mean all museums? And I said, that's a very interesting point, because often the answer is no. They're thinking about arts and they think about art museums, or maybe they're thinking about history museums. One of the things that we really emphasized when we were working with Seeding Vitality Arts on these creative aging programs was the fact that all kinds of museums can participate. So you can use art as a medium of teaching science. You can use art as a medium of interpreting nature. You can use art as a medium for exploring history. And I think, to go back to funding, one of the things we need to do is to learn to make our pitch broader than just being about the arts. The arts is a mechanism for exploration, but the funder might be the National Science Foundation. It might be the National Endowment for the Humanities. It might be a local or state arts council. So I think one of the things we need to do is be cautious about pigeonholing it, if I can use that term, as the arts, when it has a far greater impact depending on how it's deployed.
I really appreciate both of you specifically calling out state arts agencies as a critical piece of the infrastructure, the ecosystem, to make sure that the creative aging takes root. And, Heather, your point is really well taken about certainly, like, there's funding to be considered, but there's more than that too, that state arts agencies also play a role by convening people, by training teaching artists, by being a clearinghouse of good information. And we're so grateful to Aroha, NASA is, for the opportunity to sort of experiment in those ways with the leveraging state investments in creative aging. Shout out also to Lifetime Arts for being a partner in really in the training of teaching artists part of what many of our grantees are exploring. But I'm really excited in another year or two to really see what our state arts agencies develop and create and find out about these strengths that they bring uniquely in their states to really make sure that creative aging has a place at the state level in the ways that you're talking about. Another sort of topic here, we had a really great keynote session yesterday with Ashton Applewhite. And we heard a really important call to action from her to end ableism and end ageism and the ways that those two things intersect, among other forms of discrimination. And I'm wondering, in your sort of thinking about takeaways from your experiences in your networks, what can you tell us about clarity about equitable design and delivery of programs in creative aging? Have you seen successes and challenges even in how organizations in your networks are designing for difference in race or ability, geography, language, other forms of difference in creative aging? What's been successful? What's been challenging?
That's fabulous that Ashton was able to join you all and talk about that. I mean, I do think overall it's really critical to not just put anti-ageism work in its own silo, and to really think about the intersections of ageism, ableism, racism, gender, as we build these programs and we think about how we raise the visibility of the work. I mean, one of the things that, you know, the model that the Guild really trains organizations on in partnership with Lifetime Arts and others is a model that often we use the language, a model for active older adults. But I think the truth is that, you know, based on the last census, one out of every 4 Americans are living with a disability. And when you include invisible disabilities like mental health and learning disabilities, the percentage is nearly 70%. And then we know that the majority of people living with disabilities are people over the age of 65. And a lot of that data is also because we don't track disabilities before kids go to school. So the number is probably higher for school age youth than is often represented in the statistics. And so while I think there really is a difference between therapy models for creative aging and models, you know, that are serving quote unquote active older adults. The truth of it is that I would say the majority of older adults, right, that we're serving in these programs are living with some kind of disability, whether it's visible or invisible. And so I think one of the things that's really important to think about is how are, of course, we training our staff and teaching artists to recognize that, to be considerate, but how are we talking to older adults about their needs, thinking about how we can make our spaces, both our physical spaces and the programs, inclusive and supportive. Sometimes that just comes down to, like, you know, really simple things like, is there someone on your staff? Like, is there someone on your website? If someone, to make it really easy for older adults to request accommodations, right? And not to try to find the right person to ask, right? Or are your materials, do they have color contrast? Or they have big fonts? Like some really simple things, in addition to some of the things with physical space, et cetera. And so I know that I would say the majority of our Catalyzing Creative Aging grantees have had to make some kind of accommodation, and knowing that that's along a spectrum. And sometimes you also have to just be clear about what you can accommodate and not accommodate up front so that it's clear to the participant. But I think that sometimes we run this risk, and I don't know if Ashton talked about this, of there can be a risk of almost leveraging, I think, ableism to hold up a positive model of aging, right? To say, you know, so we are living longer, healthier, active lives, but it sometimes erases that really stark statistic that the majority of older adults over 65 are living with some type of disability, even if it's not visible to you. And so I think really being intentional about how you're supporting older adults who might have different abilities is really key as we move forward in this work.
I'm glad you brought up this issue based riffing on Ashton's keynote, this question of the intersectionality between aging and ageism and other isms, other factors that lead any portion of society to experience discrimination or negative stereotypes. One of the strong lessons that came out of the museums participating in Seeding Vitality Arts in Museums was the fact that you can't lump together older Americans as one group. It's sort of right there, it's sort of a false crass. It's a false group. Different people over the age of 55 have different needs. And that changes. The challenges change from year to year under circumstances. Everybody knows that older Americans were challenged during the COVID-19 pandemic by heightened isolation, which is already a problem for older Americans, in part because of limitations to mobility. But another thing that happened is a rise of anti-Asian hate and violence against Asian elders. And one of the things that our keynote speaker, Daphne Kwok, for our Museum Summit on Creative Aging next week, is going to talk about is what were the experiences of Asian American elders during COVID, and what can we do to try and bring more respect and understanding and empathy to that population. Another example of museum of audiences, older audiences that come to the table with specific needs and specific traumas and specific concerns, LGBTQA+ individuals. One of our museums, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tucson, started creating programming specifically for that community. They have a program called Stay Gold. They did an intergenerational drag program because they found that LGBTQA+ individuals, first of all, might have hesitancy about whether they were welcome in the museum, whether it's really their place, or they the traditional audience. And also, to go back to our earlier point of honoring expertise and elevating tradition, there's a community that really has had its whole history silenced for such a long time. So if you engage with that group, you have to acknowledge the trauma they're bringing to the table, the concerns they might have about having a safe place to transmit knowledge and learn, and to develop very individualized processes for interacting with different segments of your community, not just lumping it all in together and saying, yes, we have programs for older adults.
I think that is such a good point, Elizabeth, that even though we talk about different models for creative aging, none of this is one size fits all, right? And the best programs are responsive to the communities that we're working with, right? Which is why it's important to talk to them before you develop a program and to do a needs assessment and to build those relationships, right? So that these programs can be responsive to those unique individuals and their needs and their interests. I think part of this also is to recognize that teaching artists are really the lifeblood of this work, right? So when we talk about authentic, like when I think about the pandemic and what happened to our organizations, it was the teaching artists that had the relationship with the older adults. It was the teaching artists getting on the phone and checking in to see how they could help, how they could get them resources, how they could get them food, right? I mean, it was like, and the teaching artists often translating those needs back to the organization, right? And many organizations that we've worked with have been really intentional about hiring teaching artists from the communities where this work is happening, right? Who speak the languages that are spoken in that community, right? Who share a cultural background, right? And there's many examples of that. I'm going to put in the chat the Guild in partnership with the Teaching Artists Guild and the Teaching Artists of the Mid-Atlantic, which is a regional teaching artist network that many of you might be aware of. We did a series of listening tours of teaching artists across the country. And one of the things that we just continued to hear was, I really want to keep working with you all, you arts and cultural organizations, my state arts councils, but I'm struggling, right? We know that many teaching artists lost their jobs during the pandemic. Sometimes those were necessary choices, but they weren't handled always with transparency and that in ways that really honored teaching artists as real partners and leaders in this work. And so the link that I just put in the chat is a composite letter representing a multitude of perspectives that were shared that we heard from many teaching artists around the country. And it's essentially a breakup letter in all of its beauty. Like, I love you and I would love for this relationship to continue, but I need these things. And I share that under the sense of equity because I think that teaching artists sometimes get lost in the shuffle. And for this work to really, when we harm teaching artists, we're harming the students that we work with because they really are the connection to the people that we're working with in these programs, to the older adults. And so I share that because I think when we're recruiting teaching artists that are not only professional artists and sort of masters of their craft, but also have deep relationships with these communities and share cultural backgrounds, we have to honor all. They are bringing so much. Sometimes it's not even visible to organizations and to arts councils and to state arts agencies how much they are bringing in. I also just want to say that in looking at so many of the programs that are funded right now through you all, through the state arts agencies, I was really excited to see many that were really supporting networks of teaching artists doing this work, both in collaboration with organizations, but also independently. And I think it's another opportunity for you all at the state level to think about how you might be creating statewide, if they don't already exist, statewide support networks for those teaching artists, and thinking about how, just as we're trying to amplify the creative aging work overall, how we can amplify the role of teaching artistry as vital to this work throughout. So
that is a very critical piece of the puzzle. And I just, a couple of minutes ago, you know, I think the conversation that we were hearing about how responsive arts and cultural organizations, museums need to be in thinking about this engagement work. I think it really does underscore the point that we started with, which is this sort of shift, this cultural shift, making sure that the values of equity, the values of empathy are really rooted in an organization, you know, top to bottom, right to left, inside out. Because without that sort of authorization from leadership and funding to support the work of program staff, the opportunities to cultivate a very responsive approach to different communities and not have a one size fits all kind of program, that's what it takes. It strikes me. It really does. So just that, yeah, just really appreciating how in considering equitable design and delivery, we're sort of right back where we started at the buy-in and the embrace of an organization leadership and everyone else. And, you know, Elizabeth, you had said something in our prep that I think it's just a beautiful place to maybe begin to bring this part of our conversation in for a close about you as a futurist for museums.
Yes. Yeah.
You were building on something Heather said about really being human-centered, really being in that space of focusing on the people.
Yep.
So
yes.
Tell us more.
I'll start with a little in-joke from museums, which is that you could have an auto generator on the web that would generate museum missions that would fill in the nouns and verbs. It's something like, you know, we create, preserve, and interpret fill in the blank art through doing the programming and collecting and a long list of things they do. It's a traditional mission statement. And one of the things I do as a consulting futurist when I work with a museum is to try and blow that out of the water, you know, respect it and say, okay, but fine, set it aside for a minute and say, what is the difference you really want to make in the world? How do you want the world to be better because you exist? And specifically when we're looking at the difference we're going to make towards older audiences, how do we want to make the lives of older audiences richer, healthier, more rewarding because the museum exists? So once you start with that question, how do you want the world to be different and better because of the work you do, with the ultimate goal being people being healthier, people being happier, people having better social connections, you don't keep coming back to the same solutions over and over again. It's not just, well, we'll do an exhibit about it, or we'll have a program about it. It opens you up to saying, what do you need and what can we do given our resources to address it? And once you start from that, how you want their lives to be different and what you have as resources, museums come to all sort of unexpected solutions. You have things like the museum, the Anacostia Museum here in DC, putting a food fridge in the parking lot so people could pick up meals if they needed it during the pandemic. You have other museums that were doing free lunch for local audiences. Show in and say, show up and tell us you need a free lunch and we'll give you a bag lunch to go. We had museums taking their grounds and saying, let's start a community garden, because again, food's an issue. We need to produce more and be able to give it to food banks and give it away. What you need is ways to take care of your kids at home when they're doing virtual schooling. Great, we'll create art kits and you can pick them up and it's a way to keep the kids busy without it necessarily being screen time. My least favorite term is mission creep, because sometimes people invoke that as if it's the worst thing in the world, that if it's not listed in your mission, you shouldn't do it. And I would flip it around and say, that's doing whatever needs to be done to meet the needs of the people in your community. If you remember Prairie Home Companion, one of the fake ads was powder milk biscuits give you the strength to get up and do what needs to be done. And that's really the question. How can you be a museum or an arts organization like Project Row Houses in Houston that says, you need a laundromat, we can do a laundromat. You need a program to support young mothers so they can stay in school, we can provide daycare. And yes, it's through a lens of art, but it's saying, yeah, start with the need. And then as a museum art space, how can we fill that need in a uniquely museum-y way?
Beautifully said. Heather, do you have a thought to add?
No, I couldn't. I mean, yes, all of that. I just want to go back and just say, I mean, I really think that the organizations that we saw really be able to sustain and almost even thrive during the pandemic were those that actually started with people first. And really, because those humans stayed with them, those relationships remained. And so when they were ready to kind of open back up, they were right there. They were right there. The older adults, the younger adults, and the teaching artists were still there because they maintained those relationships and they centered people first.
Fantastic. I think that we're just getting ready to transition into having some audience Q&A. But I'm gonna shoot you both a question here that I'm gonna go off script. So get ready. If you have one, from your experience in your networks and knowing that the state arts agencies are coming online stronger and stronger with creative aging, what is one piece of advice or desire that you might have from your vantage point in your networks and your spaces that you might want to see from state arts agencies diving into this work and partnering with you or partnering with your organizations? What would be one wish that you would have?
I'll jump in a little bit, just speaking off the top of my head. One is, don't make assumptions about who the best partners are going to be. Because to what I said earlier, it might be a science museum, it might be a nature center, it might be a really small museum that's embedded in the community. It may be some quirky little founder-led organization that has a great deal of latitude about what it does. So go beyond the obvious suspects in looking for partners who really could be very flexible and deeply embedded in this work.
Yeah, I think I really just think that don't let it happen in a silo in all of the ways, right? So when if teaching artists or an organization is working in partnership, make sure more than one person in that partner organization is involved in the program. Make sure that it doesn't just sit with a teaching artist and a program director within an organization, but that there's really opportunities for them to share out at staff meetings what they're doing, to share out at board meetings. Make sure that you're really throughout the way that they have support, and invite the community in. I think that's the other thing sometimes, right? That it's like this program happens and then there's a culminating event and only a few people get to see it. And I think the ones that have really been able to sustain and grow, and not even grow, just sustain, are the ones that have continued to bring in different community stakeholders to see the work. And then for older adults to realize, like, I think for them to realize how much older adults can do and how amazing they are in these programs, and for older adults to really be seen in the broader community is really powerful. So don't silo the work, bring in as many people at as many different levels as you can. And that's how it's going to stay. That's how it's going to become rooted.
Really words of wisdom from you both. And again, just deep appreciation for all the work that you've been doing in your spaces and your networks. Before we, really move to Q&A, first, I'm going to ask you if there's anything else that we just haven't covered that's in your heart to share. And then I'm going to invite you to plug some upcoming events that I know that you both have but don't hesitate to take this moment if there's something that you're like, oh, I meant to mention, because we do want to hear that too.
I'm going to throw out an invitation for anybody on in the presentation to help me fill a big gap in my ignorance, because as I was talking about Susan and Heather earlier, I have no data about teaching artists working with museums. It just hasn't gotten captured in any of the ways that we collect data about who works with and in museums. So if any of you know of sources of information, I'm pursuing with some leads Susan gave me, but sources of information about teaching artists and how they work with museums, I'd love to hear that. So that's my comment.
Great. Anything else from you, Heather, before we transition?
No, we covered a lot of ground, so I'm good.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, then I'm going to leave it to you both then to share a bit about what your upcoming opportunities are, and then we'll take some questions. Elizabeth, you want to go ahead?
Oh, sure. I am so excited because we are just about a week out from an event next Thursday on July 29th, which is AAM's Museum Summit on Creative Aging, which we're presenting with support from Aroha Philanthropies. And I will drop a link into chat for where you can pre-register for that. We're going to spend the afternoon starting with a keynote by Daphne Kwok from AARP looking about ageism, racism, how to support Asian elders, and more broadly, how to build inclusion and empathy and a sense of belonging in elders from a number of communities. We're going to be hosting a wonderful workshop by Maura and Annie as well. And we're going to be hearing some of the stories firsthand from museums that have participated in Seeding Vitality Arts in Museums and have actual experience delivering this programming. We're going to be having a conversation about how you can build partnerships with other providers and funders to try and create sustainable networks for this work. And we're also going to provide a platform for attendees to just chat with some of the people who do this work and go into it more deeply in some breakout rooms at the end. So I hope to see some of you in that audience.
Thanks for that. And the link to that registration for the Museum Summit is in the chat. Thank you for putting it there. How about you, Heather?
All right, I'm going to put my things here in the chat too to make it easy for everyone. So we have three things I want to draw to your attention to. One is we are doing a virtual gathering this fall. It's 3 weeks called Groundwork Healing Within Community Arts Education. There will be a dedicated creative aging track with support from Aroha Philanthropies. This is a really incredible program. We've developed it in collaboration with a number of community advisors. And is focused on kind of three frameworks that we have to kind of get right with ourselves. So healing the self, healing the collective. So what does healing look like within our organizations and our communities? And then what does that look like when those things happen? How can we then better work together to move things forward in terms of movement building? And so creative aging will be examined through those lenses over 3 weeks. And we have a current call for proposals out. And so if you click on that link, you can learn more about that program. We also, since April of 2020, have been hosting monthly community conversations, which are open to all. You do not have to be a guild member. And monthly, there is a creative aging community conversation. This is really like a water cooler chit chat where you can come together with others. We have teaching artists, we have arts administrators, we have a range of folks that show up to those conversations, and has become a real peer network to share information, advice, ideas, and support with one another in a regular way. And then lastly, I'm really excited about this. Many years ago, we published a toolkit in English and in Spanish called Creativity Matters, the Arts and Aging Toolkit. This is like a primer on creative aging programs and how to partner with the aging services sector. And we are downsizing our office. We have many, many of these books to give away, and we would love to mail some to you. So for free, if you would like to order a Creativity Matters Arts and Aging Toolkit, there's a link there in the chat to order. We will mail them to you. it's somewhat evergreen. There's some really great stuff in there. And we have English and Spanish language versions of that publication. And they're yours if you want them. So let us know.
Thanks both. And I hope everybody knows just how accessible and collegial Elizabeth and Heather are. So I'm sure I can speak for you both in saying, please reach out to both with questions and just networking. We covered a lot of territory, and the chat was mostly quiet. I know people, are absorbing and listening, but I want to share a really great question that my dear colleague Jean Irwin in Utah sent in regarding our conversation about, I guess for lack of a better word, the seeming tension or opposition between funding arts learning for P12 and arts learning for other communities. So Jean's question is, funding for P12 is sort of assuming that this nation adequately funds K-12 education. However, the inequity in education is profound, especially for children of color and children with disabilities. And the pandemic really revealed those inequities. As an arts educator in Utah, we are at the bottom 2 or 3 states that spends the least on per pupil expenditure per student. And we have the largest class sizes in the nation, as many as something like 50 students in a secondary English class, as an example. So the question that she's posing is, how do we advocate for more older adults to participate in arts learning and still adequately serve K-12 students?
I can start a little. Oh, go ahead.
I'll jump in here and hope my
Go.
colleagues approve of what I say, which is, please don't frame this as a limited pie where the conflict is between the funding that we give through P through 12 or education and funding we give for education of older adults. There are lots of things we spend money on in government. And all of it should be up for conversation when we're talking about our values and what we want to spend money on. So the first thing I would say is advocacy is never talk or frame the question as if it's those two things competing for the same limited pot of money.
Elizabeth took the words right out of my mouth. Yeah, I think sometimes we operate in a scarcity model thinking. And I think if we shifted to an abundance model of thinking, we might get more creative. And I think, I also think that it's funny. I mean, getting back to your point, Elizabeth, about what do we want the future to look like? This either or, like you're in K through 12 and then you're out, and then who knows what happens to you, right? Like, what if we shifted to how we really uplift community health and invest in community health in a really holistic way? I think we would realize more opportunities. And I think that the fact that the majority, like the vast majority of this funding is coming from the arts sector and philanthropy, there's a huge opportunity for us to get investment from other sectors, health, disability, I think we have to get creative, and we have to shift our mindset to one of abundance, and really think about how we're making those clear links, but also relationships.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you said that, because I can relate to Jean's question and sort of where she's coming from, working to date myself extensively in K-12 education. And not to put words in your mouth, Jean, but my kind of take on your question is that, it really is such a huge multi-layered system. It's such a huge structural entity. And it really does feel, the experience of working within it does feel like there's not enough to go around, So it's not like that's an imaginary feeling or an imaginary sense, like it's often the case that there's not adequate funding for sure. But point taken that sure, like the abundance mindset or thinking sort of more broadly is an important part of this. And that's why I think, a comment that Elizabeth made a while ago about the investment, the sort of shared cost or the shared opportunity for investment across the healthcare industry, the insurance industry, like that's a really interesting I don't know that I would say that it's concrete yet, but that's a sort of pathway to develop relationships or to develop advocacy points or whatever the case may be, to really know that and internalize the fact that the opportunity to share that investment is bigger than we sometimes think that it is.
Well,
I just want to push a little because I feel like abundance mindset is true, but like, how do we get concrete about it?
Well, this points to the importance of choosing smart metrics and then using it for advocacy. So I'm going to say this and then I'm going to back up and argue with myself. First of all, there's really good data backing up the fact that arts participation and this particular model of arts participation has positive effects on health, right? So it does save health providers money in the end if older adults have social connections, or get out and have mental activity. And in fact, there are some places in Canada, and I believe just beginning in the US, where in California, where you're starting to have programs where doctors can write prescriptions for museum visits that are funded by healthcare companies because they know it helps, okay? So there's that. Now, as a futurist, I have to straddle the boundary between the present and the future I hope will exist, between the way we actually work now and the way I personally think we should work. Right now, we live in a relentlessly capitalist society. And when you're asked to justify programs like this, it all comes down to money. So like, are people healthier and more productive and add more to the economy in the long run if they go to preschool? Okay, yes, we can show that, fine. You know, are older adults healthier and cost less if they do programs like this? Yes, we can prove that. Keep building up the data, keep showing it to the policymakers. I think there are far stronger reasons to do those things than the fact that you can connect it directly to whether it's more profitable for companies to do business in that environment, or whether our gross national product value goes up. I think every child deserves a chance to go to a stimulating, healthy, safe preschool, because that's what we owe our children. I think that every older adult deserves opportunities for meaningful social connection and learning, because it's a value we should have as a society. That's not the system we live in right now, where we shape our expenditures just by those values. So in the meantime, we have to learn to make the economic arguments without ceding the ground, while continuing to make the statement as influential nonprofit organizations in society that we should be talking about those other values.
Thanks for that.
I think that I think we're also in an interesting moment, and I've talked with Annie and Maura, who are on this call too, about this, that we're in the pandemic, where all of us have experienced some degree of social isolation in the past 12 to 15 months. And now, that is not to say that the social isolation I felt is comparable necessarily to many, and to many older adults. But I think that there's a real, at a human level, a real need, an understanding of what that can do both for young people and older adults, right? We're seeing escalating mental health issues with young people, right? To speak to the person that offered the question. And AARP is calling social isolation a pandemic, right? And so I think that it's also like, where is that common ground in our human experience? And tying it to that data, right? Tying it to that very immediate felt experience as a way to start to open up conversations, and then tie it back to the real solid research that's showing that these programs, are consistently, older adults are saying that they feel less lonely and that they feel a much greater sense of interest in life, right? Well, I think the same, we're seeing the same in terms of arts learning in schools. And one thing we haven't talked about, because it's not really the model that I think we're focusing on here, is also opportunities to bring older adults and school-age youth together, right? In ways that, which I think, I would hope, Elizabeth, is part of our future. And I say that also knowing that if we were to do that, those have to be spaces that are really carefully facilitated, because there is ageism felt from the side of younger, what younger people assume about older adults, and there's adultism, right? There's what older adults assume about young people. But I think if we can create spaces where real exciting intergenerational learning can happen in ways that also center the learning needs and interest of older adults. Sometimes it's like at the expense of the older adult experience that we bring older adults into young people's spaces. I think there's also over time opportunities to realize that maybe our lives aren't as separate, right? Like maybe there are more connections than we think. And then those younger adults can grow up to realize the real value that older adults have in our communities. I do really understand what the person is asking in terms of the scarcity of funding for young people in schools, but I'm hopeful that maybe some of these connections can be made in a stronger way by more of us. That wealth can be more abundant for both.
Absolutely. Oh, Elizabeth, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, absolutely echo what you say about the importance of it being intergenerational learning. But I also wanted to build on what you pointed about the vulnerabilities that were exposed by COVID. So bear with me here. I'm just trying to work out how to say this. A lot of the times when we advocate for this programming, it's very narrowly and specific about this program and the results of this program. And I think as a futurist, I'm going to advocate we step back a moment and recognize that we live in a world where a lot of the hardwired systems that we've created are very fragile in the face of the kinds of disruptions we're going to face in coming decades. And COVID exposed that. So for example, saying that children learn by going to school and parents basically can take care of their kids while they go work by sending them to school, and children who need meals because their families are insecure, food insecure, can get their meals at school. And older adults, can support themselves by doing this, that, and the other. All of those assumptions were blown out of the water because all of our basic systems during the pandemic were disrupted. And they're going to continue to be disrupted by cyber attacks, internet outages, extreme heat, extreme weather, rising tides, climate change in general, challenges to our political structure. I think what we also have to be aware of is making the case that all of these semi-invisible connections, this sort of nonprofit web that exists behind the official institutions that do these things, are more resilient than the obvious fragile official answers. So that's why during the pandemic, when all of those official systems of school and work and transportation and unemployment insurance got blown out of the water, it was us, it was nonprofits with the soft connections we had created and our ability to pivot and find creative solutions that helped buoy people up. And we need to have that go from behind the scenes to in front of the scenes, to explicitly value that as being part of creating a resilient network for people to live in. It's not just investing in schools. It's not just investing in these official ways of taking care of problems. It's recognizing that people like us working together, organizations like museums and art agencies working together, create a more resilient web for supporting people in the face of the disruptions we're going to have in the coming century.
Elizabeth, it was really worth it bearing with you as you got your thoughts together on that. Thank you. That was just a super, super interesting response. Heather, I feel like you were just about to chime in, so sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all. I just love that so much. Thanks, Elizabeth.
I really appreciate, Jean. That was a really potent question. So thanks for bringing that forward. We're getting a little bit close to wrapping up. We still have time for one or two more questions, and it would be wonderful to hear other voices. So if anyone has a question that you want to unmute yourself or use the raise hand, either way is really fine with me. You could just chime right in. We would love to hear.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you tell us where you are joining us from?
Thanks. I'm joining us from Lopatcong, New Jersey. I used to be a resident of Hell's Kitchen, but traditional stewards from the Lenni Lenape people. And I was wondering, as one can say freelance teaching artist, and specifically with the Parkinson's community, but theater maker within the older community, I wanted to just to gauge, as I start to build more programming in my own experience as a theater maker and a creative writer, how attaching myself to an institution versus creating my own curriculum might, some of the challenges that I have already faced, but that you might see, and how to perhaps bridge, besides the old employment route of a teaching artist, seeking that out, creating new avenues for a freelancer into institutions that already exist. Because although I reinvent the wheel many times a day, I don't want to reinvent something that's already there. Hence my connection with Dance for PD or something like that. Is there anything you might be able to elucidate my trails here? Thanks.
Michael, I just want to make sure I understand your question. Are you asking what is sort of a good pathway as an independent teaching artist who wants to maybe get into this work? What are first steps? Or I just want to make sure I'm understanding what sort of the...
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. It was a little long-winded. It was the first steps to approach a larger institution. I've done it through, through their education or outreach programs, but yeah, exactly.
I can start, but I also know my colleagues Annie and Maura are on this call, who are working a lot with teaching artists around the country around this very same thing. So maybe I know I'm breaking maybe the fourth wall here, but I might call on Annie and Maura to talk about what they're seeing too. But I do know, I just want to shout out, Lifetime Arts has some great resources on their website. I don't know, Susan, if or Carol, if you could put their website in the chat, but they have a free resource with just tons of lovely things about the creative aging model, things that they're learning about adapting that work to online audiences and digital spaces, and resources on partnerships. So I would say, number one, seek out some of what is already out there, right? So I think citing one, research, like as Elizabeth and I have noted, of like the benefits of this work, and that this isn't just an opinion. This is like really, there's longstanding research that's backing up the benefits of this work, and tie that to the mission of the organization, right? That that you're seeing value not just for the older adults, but also for the organization and delivering on their mission. I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel. There's a pretty great model out there that ties back to this research. So I think go look at some of those really fantastic things. There's some great case studies of other work by teaching artists and organizations, both on the Guild's website. I know in the new report that Elizabeth, AM just came out with, looking at work in museums, and that Lifetime Arts has. So I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel. And Annie and Maura, I don't know if you have any advice from your perspective in like working so directly with teaching artists now about sort of ways that they're seeing pathways into organizations who might not yet have adopted this as a model, but where teaching artists might want to partner. I'm putting you on the spot, I know.
That's okay. Do you want me to go more, or do you want to chime in? Yeah, okay. One thing I would just probably circle back most intentionally is this idea of human-centered work. I think that teaching artists like Heather and Elizabeth so beautifully illustrated really are the heart and blood of this work, and honestly, I think actually is really keeping it going before we get sort of those systems really behind us. But with that, working as an independent contractor can be kind of challenging, because you are working as an independent artist in a new model of programming that specifically in sort of senior serving organizations, libraries, non-arts and cultural organizations haven't seen this model of practice for their older adult learners, which is just briefly, sequential programming and an arts residency model, just to quickly sum it up. So getting to know that community in a really organic way first is important. That might mean volunteering. That might mean spending time, asking a lot of questions, listening before you start to say, you know, I'd be great at this, you know, building this theater residency with them, because that may not be what they want, but it might be. You just have to really sort of embed yourself as an independent contractor really intentionally with what the folks who you're hoping to serve want and need. That's where I would start. Yeah, go ahead.
I really appreciate that so much. And I want to just put a pause there, because I want to invite not only Michael, but everybody to make sure to come back at 4:45 to hear you and Maura go deep into that. We also will hear from the teaching artist perspective next week, so encouraging everybody to dial back in next week. There is one other question that sort of touches on something Heather said, that maybe Elizabeth and Heather, just a quick response before we sign off. And that is, have studies been done to make creative aging an evidence-based program so that we can use Older Americans Act money to fund them? Quick thoughts on that.
Well, I mentioned too, so Jean Cohen out of Harvard, Susan, I don't know if you have that link at hand, did a 10-year longitudinal study that really is sort of the backbone for the model that the Guild and Lifetime Arts and that Elizabeth's team is working with. And that really looks at sustained participatory arts programs. So, you know, our model is looking at, 90-minute, when it was in person, right? 90 minutes over 10 to 12 weeks, right? So in a sustained engagement that's building art skills over time, taught by professional teaching artists that intentionally integrate social engagement. And that study looked at, a control group and saw that there was, significant health and wellness benefits. Older adults were taking fewer medications. They were reporting greater wellness. And so there's that study, which was really a landmark study, I think, for this work. The other study I mentioned earlier was the Community of Voices study with the Community Music Center of San Francisco, which really echoed that study. They found less direct ties to cognitive and physical benefits, but overwhelming benefits in terms of wellness and mental health. So, so those are just two that are out there that were, longitudinal, and I think could really be pointed to as data points.
Thank you so much. That was a question for Wendy, who asked it in the chat a while ago. Elizabeth, with your grace, I am going to apologetically have to bring us to an intermission. It has been a pleasure to be in dialogue with you both today. And I really want to thank you for the important work that you're doing and continue to do and have done. And also for just being so welcoming of the state arts agencies into just these thriving networks of creative aging practitioners and participants that you are so expertly tending in your spaces. Let's promise each other to stay closely connected so that we can keep building together as we go forward. And thank you again, Elizabeth and Heather. It was truly a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.